everyone. Sorry I couldn't be there with you in person. So as mentioned, my name's Shireen. I'm a constitutional lawyer. I'm of Indian and Fijian Indian heritage, and I was born here in Melbourne. But about 12 years ago, when I was studying law at Monash, I went and did this internship program that took me up to Cape York, took me up to Cairns, and I spent my university holidays volunteering at Cape York Institute, where I met the Aboriginal leader Noel Pearson. And Noel must have been impressed with something I did, because he unexpectedly offered me a job working on this question of how should we recognise Indigenous peoples in the Australian Constitution. So it's been 7 years. I then went and worked for the Institute for 7 years, and it's now been 12 years of collaboration with Noel and Indigenous leaders around the country on this question. So the first thing I learned from Noel and others was about the history, that in the 1800s, when the representatives of the colonies were getting together to figure out how they were going to unite to create this new nation, Australia, not a single Indigenous representative was included in those discussions, even though Indigenous people had lived on this continent for over 65,000 years. So as a result of that original exclusion, the Constitution that came into force in 1901, Australia's highest legal rulebook, contained clauses explicitly excluding Indigenous people. Constitutional lawyers, we talk about the Constitution as a power-sharing compact because it's all about power. It's the document that distributes legal and political power out throughout our country, and it sets in place high-level rules and principles for how power is exercised. But for Indigenous people who were excluded in those discussions, it set up a position of real powerlessness. And the Uluru Statement from the Heart talks about the torment of powerlessness that Indigenous people have experienced under the Constitution. So it set up this really top-down power relationship with Indigenous people. Noel always used to talk about the elephant and the mouse dynamic that characterises Indigenous affairs, because Indigenous people, being only 3% of the population, have been like this kind of 3% mouse, squeaking and trying to be heard by this almighty 97% non-Indigenous elephant that wields the majority of political and legal power in this country. So you can see how this top-down power relationship has played out throughout our history, because there have been many discriminatory and unfair laws and policies made about Indigenous people, enabled by the Constitution and this top-down power relationship. I'm talking about laws that denied Indigenous people the vote in some jurisdictions right up until the 60s. And in fact, perfect voting equality across the board wasn't actually achieved until about 1984, because it wasn't compulsory for Indigenous people to vote before then. I'm talking about policies that denied them the payment of equal wages for their hard work, sometimes non-payment of wages, have some food rations instead. I'm talking about policies that forcibly removed children, controlled where they could live, who they could marry, sometimes banned their languages from being spoken. And some of these protectionist policies lasted right up until the 70s, late 70s in some areas. But even today, even though most of that harsh discrimination is in the past, the top-down power dynamic still continues. Because if you read what the Productivity Commission said about Australia's efforts at closing the gap, the Productivity Commission a few weeks ago said what Indigenous people have been saying for years. They said that Australia is failing to close the gap. Why? Because everything is top-down. Because politicians and bureaucrats in Canberra, despite good intentions and despite money spent, simply do not listen to Indigenous communities. They don't partner with Indigenous communities when making laws and policies intended to assist them. Therefore, despite good intentions and despite the money being spent, the gap on some indicators is actually getting wider, not narrower. So this is why, because of this history, Indigenous advocates for decades and decades and decades have asked for substantive constitutional recognition, not something just symbolic, but substantive, empowering constitutional recognition to create a fairer power relationship with Australian governments, to shift from the top-down approach that's failed for 200 years to a more partnership approach. And this is why the call for a voice has been repeated and long-standing. Since 1937, when William Cooper petitioned the British King asking for a voice in Parliament. And in the 60s, the Yolngu people issued the Bark petitions asking for fairer consultation when government makes decisions about them and their land. And then in 1988, the Barunga Statement was given to Bob Hawke asking for a national body to give Indigenous people a voice in laws and policies made about them. Subsequently, ATSIC, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, was enacted, but only in legislation. It wasn't underpinned by a constitutional guarantee of permanency, right? So when the politics changed and problems arose, it was just chucked out. So this is why Indigenous people, through the Uluru Statement from the Heart, are asking for a constitutionally guaranteed voice, right? So that their voice will always be heard in laws and policies made about them. And I think it's an incredibly modest request that Indigenous people are making. And I want to quickly share my screen with you to show you what we're actually voting on in this referendum. Someone let me know if you can't see this. But this is what this referendum boils down to, a yes or no question. Yes or no? Do we say yes to finally recognising Indigenous peoples in the Constitution from which they were excluded in 1901, through giving them an advisory voice in laws and policies made about them? Now, you'll notice that the no case wants to talk about everything other than the actual change to the Constitution. They want to talk about welcome to country, the date of Australia Day, submarines, parking tickets, you know, everything. Warren Mundine even wants to talk about declarations of war, for goodness sake. But that is not what this referendum is about. This referendum is about whether or not the Australian people agree to insert these words. So I want to quickly take you through these words. The first line says, in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia. This is what this whole conversation is about, right? This is about recognising the group that was excluded in 1901. It's about including Indigenous peoples and recognising them as the first peoples. And how do they want to be recognised? They want to be recognised in a practical way, in a way that will help them close the gap and improve outcomes in their communities. So the first clause calls for a voice, a practical voice. It says, there shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. There shall be a body. If we vote yes, this is our guarantee. Those are our words of commitment. It would be our national promise, our commitment that there will always be a voice for Indigenous people in this country, that Indigenous communities will always be heard in their affairs. So there shall be a body. That's like our promise, us telling the Parliament, there shall always be a body, there shall be a body, yeah? So that clause 1, that's the guarantee. Clause 2 says what the job of this body is. It says the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice may make representations to the Parliament and the Executive Government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. May make representations. That just means can give advice. In fact, representations is a more legally modest way of saying advice, because it makes doubly, triply sure that this is non-binding. There's no expectation that Parliament and government have to follow the advice, right? It's merely advisory, non-binding representations. Parliament and government stay in charge, okay? And what does the voice make representations on? It makes representations on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So it's pretty simple. This is an Indigenous advisory body that will give advice to Parliament and the government on matters relating to Indigenous peoples. The third clause is really important. It says the Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to matters relating to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, including its composition, functions, powers and procedures. So you know when people ask, where's the detail? Who's hiding the detail? How come we haven't seen the detail? Well, I always show them the proposed constitutional change and I show them clause 3 because it says it's Parliament's job to legislate the detail. So if we vote yes to the principle of recognising Indigenous people in the Constitution by giving them an advisory voice, if we vote yes to that, then it's Parliament's job to legislate all the details about how this voice will look and how it will operate. And importantly, that means that future parliaments can completely change the detail. It means the detail is flexible, yeah? So that is what we're actually voting on. And I think it's extraordinarily modest. What people may not know is that while Indigenous people have called for a voice in their affairs for over 100 years, this constitutional amendment actually arose around about 8-9 years ago off the back of all of that Indigenous advocacy. It arose through collaboration between Indigenous leaders and actually constitutional conservatives, people like the now Liberal MP Julian Leeser, who resigned from the shadow cabinet because he so passionately supports this. And I just say that to emphasise the fact that this is not something that comes only from Labor. You know, in fact, it comes from collaboration between Indigenous people and Conservatives, including a member of the Liberal Party who was pushing this long before Labor was actually. So this is not an election. This is a referendum. This is not about Labor or Liberal, okay? This is about what's right or wrong, what's good for the country. And Indigenous people are asking very modestly, very humbly, as the previous speaker said, I totally agree. It's such a humble request because think about it. After everything they've been through in this country, the exclusion, the discrimination, indeed the violence, they are coming to us with hands outstretched saying, please recognise us, please include us in the Constitution. And all they're asking for is an advisory voice in their affairs. So we have 2 weeks to dispel the myths, dispel the fears, get this accurate information out there to every undecided voter we possibly can. So I really look forward to working with you all, hopefully getting this over the line on the 14th of October. Thank you.
Thank you, Shireen. That was great. You actually answered a number of questions that were, thank you. So thanks, Shireen. You've actually answered already a number of questions that were put forward from audience members asking about the composition of the voice, the election of the voice, and by letting us know that it is really up to Parliament to decide the nature of the voice and that may change depending on who is in Parliament, depending on what is needed. And you were also under time, so that was also really fantastic.